Please be seated and good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see you. I can always tell Nancy Josie has been here because it's still a little back here. In our scriptures today, it seems that life is just unfair. The workers who come in at the last minute are rewarded the same amount of pay as those who worked all day. Jonah, who had worshipped God as an Israelite, resents the idea of those Ninevites being forgiven after all the evil they have done to Israel. And the Apostle Paul is in prison for preaching the gospel. So doing right doesn't seem to matter. Or does it? But what if we heard the same story from different perspectives? Bernard Scribner asked the question, what if that morning had dawned and the first severe storm was about fast approaching? Even in the not so distant future, weather notifications were not as sophisticated as they are today. So they could have gone out like a normal day to work. Then the owner of the farm perhaps senses a storm is coming. So he hires some extra hands. Everything's rolling, all working together to carry out. And they're not taking breaks, and they're calling for more workers to come on. I'll take care of you. As the height of the storm sets in, they can hardly see for the blinding rain. And all are more joyful because the workers arrive to help save the day until it's paytime. Now, I'm not sure how this story sits with you, and the question is often asked, why would Jesus even bring this up? I mean, he's certainly not trying to stir up labor relations discussion, or I don't think he's illustrating that Jesus is being anti-union. That can't be it. Because when Jesus tells a story, he is trying to tell us, something about God and what it means to live in God's kingdom. And we can bet our last dollar, Jesus isn't trying to say that God is not fair or unjust. Nor do I think he's saying people should get off scot-free. Consequences for decisions are often included in Jesus' teaching. So as Jesus continues his parable of the grumbling workers, his point, or at least one of them, we know there are multiple points for parables, is that God is more than fair. We know that our God is a God of grace, and that life in his kingdom is lived under grace for any of us. But I like how the Reverend Scribner observes that God's call issued to us is not the offer of contract, but the bestowal of a gift. Wine, coming from the vineyard in Jesus' day, was not only safer to drink than water, but it also symbolized and shared joy of the community. All would benefit from the production of the wine. And without the extra workers, they may not have been able to secure the harvest without them. The problem, however, became, rather than seeing that call to go out as a gift, it got riddled with resentment. And not just by our grumbling workers, but it's also, as we heard in the story of Jonah. In a 3-year cycle in our lectionary, we only get to hear one chapter from the prophet Jonah. So you have to read Jonah on your own, okay? But if you're fortunate enough to grow up in Sunday school, you likely know the story of Jonah and the whale, or you've read it to your grandchildren. It's also a popular story even in literature. So even without being aware of the great theological impact of the book of Jonah, you know the basic story. It concerns a disobedient prophet who rejects his divine commission. He's cast overboard in a storm by sailors at Jonah's request. The sailors, in turn, go to worship Jonah's God. As a result of the waves subsiding and their lives being saved, we know that Jonah gets swallowed by the fish, whale, and is rescued when the whale spits him back out on the beach, which brings him back to the starting point. Now, given a second chance, Jonah doesn't worship, but listens reluctantly, and he does as he's told, as he goes to Nineveh, which was the capital of Israel's ancient enemy. And here he tells the people to repent and quit going their evil ways. He does as he's told. Then he leaves that city and he hangs out just in case. He builds a booth just to watch it fall, because he is sure, he is full well they are not going to listen. But when the people of Nineveh do repent and turn to God, rather than Jonah being grateful that he had another chance to do God's will, he in his resentment, as you heard it twice, he literally would rather die than for God to show grace to his enemy. The story of Jonah provides a lot of allegory and a lot of images. I mean, Nineveh is that powerful enemy. Think about your Nineveh. Tarshish, for Jonah, it would be the farthest thing away from Nineveh that he could perceive. The bush comes up to bring comfort, and then but the worms eating away at the shade, and the comfort suggests God's correction to that selfishness. The wind comes as the breath of God, acting on the behalf of God, but it is Jonah who can represent any of us at any given time when God calls us into action, and we would rather cling to our stubborn, unforgiving ways than to go God's way. Is anybody familiar with the book? Jill Briscoe wrote a book, a children's book called Jonah and the Worm. And that's a good book over there. You might like that one. But Jonah and the Worm, and she tells the story of Jonah from the perspective of the worm that attacked the bush. And little worm had been raised in the country with a loving family and a desire to marry someday his beloved silkworm. However, when the wonder maker, God, calls him to go to Nineveh, he does so without wavering or delay. And throughout this little book, little worm is the antithesis of Jonah, giving up his own life, and all without grumbling. As the story of Jonah and the worm unfolds, it turns out the wonder maker not only called Jonah, but he called the sailors who ended up worshiping him, the whale that spit him out and went where the wonder maker asked him to go, the bush did as it was told, and the worm. And it's only Jonah, the one with the most knowledge and with all of the advantages in life, the one who had been saved from the belly of the whale and given another chance. He was the only one that resented his assignment. He lost his focus of God being the giver. Instead, got hung up on what another group of people or another person got or didn't get. The vineyard workers, back to them, rather than focusing on the gift of the extra help in the fields, lost their way as they begrudged the generosity of the owner, whom we know to represent God. As Jesus taught, may we focus on the God in Christ who called us out of darkness into light, and may we not resent the God or those he sends, even if it's a bush or worm, who toward all of us, that God who has been more than fair. Amen.
Amen.